Welcome back, everyone. We continue our voyage in the Ne1 del Plata variation and continue looking at bishop d2. And the last line we checked the most critical forcing stuff with 13c5, where white pushes immediately on the queen side. But as we just saw, black is completely fine. And so white started to have a look at other ways of playing. I don't think any of these are particularly challenging, but white is just trying to keep some game alive here. But we'll see what crops up. So we can blitz through our moves. We choose knight c6 this time, the knight e1 variation, and white starts with knight d3, and then bishop d2. Later in the course, we'll check white starting with f3 instead, and even leaving the bishop back on c1 is probably the most topical continuation. As we saw earlier in the video, bishop e3 immediately has been neutralized, and the line with bishop d2 is also hitting a dead end for white. So they're trying keeping the bishop back on c1. But all in good time. We'll get there. We attack the pawn. And yeah, so c5 is what we've already covered and is by far the main move. But let's have a look at some alternatives. b4, I briefly discussed this in the last video. I don't really understand the point of b4, to be honest. c5 could have been played anyway, and the pawn on b4 gets in the way of the whole plan with bishop a5, attacking the pawn on c7. It's kind of a bit aimless. White is saying, yeah, I know my job, grab space on the queen side, but the pawn doesn't actually do anything. It also gets in the way that white might want to use the b4 square for his knight, and now he can no longer do that. So I don't really understand the logic. Okay, we're happy to play opponents play not particularly logical moves. It probably shows a lack of understanding on white's point, or perhaps of mine, and I'm missing some key idea. But anyway, we continue with g5. Play normally. White could also grab some space with a4, but we'll carry on. h5. We can play our typical shuffling here. Because there's no pressure on c7 yet, we might be able to just put the rook immediately on the g file and just go for it. White's not distracted us with anything yet. c5, start with knight g6, all the usual moves. Here we're keeping maximum flexibility. White might be about to play rook c1 and cd and knight b5, so we always have to make sure we can react to that with rook f7. Knight f2. White at least has found a point to the pawn being on b4, as it's defending the pawn on c5, but I'm never very scared by white going backwards like this. He's top on g4 for now, but it'll come eventually. We can continue our normal rejigging. The knight's not coming into c7 anytime soon, so we can take the g file immediately. We could also take this pawn, but either move is fine. Might as well go b6. Here, again, you can see another downside to the pawn being on b4. The white would like that pawn back on b2, so the knight would have access to the c6 square. He could push b5 to get the knight in, but then the pawn is blocking access for the light square bishop and c3 knight. The pawn is just in the way. White instead goes with the knight, drop the bishop back, keeping the d6 pawn under control, but mainly so we can just play rook g7. The main theme hasn't changed, that we can't allow this knight into c7 under almost any circumstances. We need to keep our light square bishop. So white shores up the g4 square. We can just gradually improve. With the rook on g7, we don't need to worry about any knight c7 ideas, sorry. Play knight h4 so that g4 is going to be more powerful when it comes. Actually, here we've reached somewhat of a stalemate. We're not throwing g4 yet. White has just enough pieces covering it. And the rook on a3 is ready to swing over to h3. But if white tries to do anything at all active, then we'll be able to play g4, like if he ever moves his queen. So if the queen can't move from d1, and the rook can't really go from f1, it's unclear what white is doing at all. But of course, it's not so easy for us to make a move either without g4. So it's some kind of stalemate position. But okay, it's up to white to try and prove something. we always have ideas of g4 that white has to be on guard against. c5, again, it kind of looks sensible, but we question why that pawn is on b4 in the first place. We continue with our normal stuff. And this has been played a surprising number of times by white, but it just seems like a bad version to me. The pawn on b4 is blocking this plan of knight b5 and bishop a5, so I don't know what white's plan is. As long as we stop the knight getting into c7, then we're very happy. We've got our typical kingside play coming with bishop f8, rook g7, knight h4 and g4, and I don't know what white is doing, to be honest. A rather bizarre choice was bishop e1, played by Sergei Karyakin. And I don't quite understand why you play bishop e1 at this point. It might be useful there, but I would have thought to play something on the queen side first. But again, we don't really need to worry too much about eccentric move orders by white. We'll just get on with it. White could push at this point, but still we'll play the normal stuff. Knight g6, so I've got g5, knight g6, h5. We can play this plan in our sleep. Got all our pieces on normal squares. We're ready to play something like king h8, bishop f8, and rook g7. Just everything gearing up to eventually break through with g4, hopefully with decisive effect. Karyakin himself played a4. Yeah, I'm not sure why the bishop needed to be on e1 to play a4. Okay, we'll just play h5, knight g6. I think Sergei's subtle plan might be that if we play the immediate g4 here, which is possible, we're defending it enough times, you might want to play bishop h4, knight g6, bishop g5, and try and annoy us with that bishop. So if we play knight g6 first, then that option isn't available. Next we'll go g4. White should probably distract us with a6. And then we'll just play b6. We're ready to play g4, and if white goes knight b4 to jump into c6, we can just block it. Once again, it's unclear to me what white is doing in this position. A more logical plan is to play a4 at this point. Now, it's always tough to know when to block this a pawn and play a5. I think, as a rule, we play a5 if white can't get in both c5 and c takes d6, forcing c takes d6. This structure is a bit ropey for us because white has an outpost on b5 for his knight. He'll jump into b5 and the pawn on d6 is always vulnerable. So we can react to a4 with a5 if either white can't play c5, in which case we can play b6, or white plays c5, but we're in time to recapture on d6 with our bishop. With bishop f8 takes d6. Here there are far too many pieces in the way, so we should simply ignore the a pawn. But we'll see other situations later in the line where we can happily play a5 here. So g5, a5, and we can just continue with h5. An alternative plan would be to play rook f7 here, knight g6, bishop f8, just be very solid that way. But we can also just play our normal stuff with h5. I don't see any problem. c5. And here I came up with a novelty that seemed sensible to me with king h8. The reason I'm just trying to keep as much flexibility in our position as possible. I want to keep the knight on e7 for the time being, because white has a plan of playing a6. And once we play ba or b6, probably we're playing ba here. Just so that we can play rook b8 at some point and activate our rook. But we want the knight to stay on e7 so that knight b4 to c6 isn't an option. So we want the knight to remain on e7. Our rook on f8 might want to go to f7 or g8, depending on white's next couple of moves. If white's threatening to infiltrate on c7, so if we play something like rook c1, then we should go rook f7. But if he plays another vague move, then we're in time to just play rook g8 and g4 and get on with it. This is the better version for white, I think, than starting with b4. He's not needing to play b4 here, and he's got access to the b4 square. For example, this a6 followed by knight b4 is a key idea that wouldn't exist if the pawn were on b4. But still, I think that we're doing okay. It's a very fresh position, and I expect white to try something like this if he's going to keep attempting to uphold the honor of the knight e1 variation, because ever theoretical, black is doing absolutely fine. So yeah, this is a fresh position, but still. We'll play rook f7 if white's threatening to come in on c7, or else we'll play rook g8 and prepare the g4 brick. Our plans are very similar to normal. One other way of playing this position is to try and block everything up on the king side with g4. We saw this plan already in the bishop e3 line, where the bishop were back on f2. This is probably a better version for white, because we've committed our knight to f6 already. So our rook is unable to get to f6, to h6, like it was there. And so it takes a bit longer. But still, our plan is the same. We're going to get the rook to the to the h file, probably via the 7th rank. So h5, knight g6, and then probably rook f7, bishop back to f8, rook h7 is our plan. Eventually, vacating the 8th rank entirely with bishop e7, king g7, and queen h8. So it takes a bit longer here than it does in the line with bishop e3 to f2, but still our plan is the same. Likewise, white's play is probably linked to playing c4, c5, but he does need to be careful that he plays it at the right time. White has a few different ways of expanding. Boris Gelfand chose b4, which is logical enough, but probably not really necessary. Like before, this pawn, it looks useful, but I'm not sure how much playing b4 really helps white with his plans of c5 or a4, a5, grabbing space. But okay, we get on with it on the king side the same way. h5. Now Caspi went king f7, followed by rook h8, which is a perfectly legitimate plan, but I think we might as well just be consistent and always go knight g6, rook f7, bishop f8 is our plan. c5, rook f7, here we go, getting all our pieces to normal squares. Here, I probably want to stop the pawn going to a6. It's just a bit annoying with the pawn on a6. We go b6 probably, but white is getting a bit more space. And while I don't think it's the end of the world, we might as well just stop the pawns at this point with a6 ourselves. The key point here is that if white takes on d6, we don't need to give away a big outpost on b6 by playing cd, when knight a4 and that knight might be really annoying on b6, but we can take back with a bishop on d6. And these structures, we should remember to take that taking back on d6 with the bishop is a very important idea, especially once white's created some potential weakness on our queenside squares. Other than that, our plan is the normal. We're going to go play rook h7, king g7, bishop e7, queen h8, open the h file, and checkmate. Might take a while, but it's a very legitimate strategy, and it's not clear what white is doing in the meantime. So white could have pushed immediately. It wasn't necessary to start with b4, but we'll do the same approach, h5, knight g6. Now, of course, white is getting ready to take and play knight b5. We shouldn't forget that just because there's a pawn on g4, white can still play that plan. So rook f7 and bishop f8. We've had this position before. Now, in a game from a few years ago, even though it was correspondence, white made a big mistake here. Went knight b5, which allowed dc. And the problem is white can't take this because of c6, and everything is hanging. The bishop on d2 is hanging. The knight can't go back to c3 because the bishop takes c5, and so white's actually losing material here. Therefore, the pawn can't be taken. Queen c3 was tried, but after a6, forcing this knight back, exchange, and now bishop takes g4 with a very nice piece sacrifice. The point is that if it's taken, we grab a pawn with tempo on the queen, we can take, and we've got these mega E and F pawns that are definitely worth at least a piece. I think already we have 3 pawns for the piece anyway, but yeah, these pawns are just so strong. While our pieces are coming to active points and white's king is very exposed. objectively white's lost here already. So knight b5 would be a big mistake. Instead, black should take this pawn. We could also recapture with the bishop here. That's always fine in these structures. But as we've not created a weakness with a6 yet, we can play cd as well, happily enough. We might as well look at the position with cd, because if white had played a very early cd himself, we might not be able to have time to put the bishop on f8. So we could be forced into this structure by a different move order. Rook c2. Here we've got a couple of good plans. Rook h7 with the idea of taking on g4 followed by rook h3. It's a good plan. The rook is getting in and going to bother white. But knight h4 is also a good idea. Our threat is to take twice on g4 with either bishop hg, hg, and then either bishop takes or knight takes, followed by f3, gaining a tempo on the bishop, and then the second piece. So probably, sorry, we'll take with the knight. So the f3 is guarded by both rook and knight. And after the bishop drops back, we can take on g4. We'll have a second pawn, and white's kingside will be just gone. So white's king is very vulnerable. I can try running, but here a pretty move is b5. The point is to open up access to the g1, a7 diagonal. Queen b6 check is a big threat. If white takes the pawn to stop it, then a5, the idea of bishop a6 increases the pressure. White's piece is already very vulnerable. Another idea is to take on g4 once again and play f3. This time with the king on f2, we can take either way with the bishop or the knight. Followed by f3 and just open up everything. And I don't think white can defend against the attack. So that was c5. White can also reroute the bishop round. This position isn't very threatening, but as we saw in the line before, that once we get a rook to h7, we have ideas of rook h3 and into g3 once h5, h3 has happened. So white could do with defending the square anyway. Of course, the bishop could have got to e1 either route via e3 to f2 to e1 or this d2 to e1. But we'll just continue with our plan. h5, h3. Now c5 actually works well here and is suggested in another chessable course and is perfectly legitimate move. I'm not recommending it just because white has so many different move orders in this lines after g4 that c5 works well here, but it doesn't always work. It works well here because white isn't well coordinated to play dc, because we can take with the knight and jump into d4. But I think it's easier if we're just consistent with our plan and we don't have to worry about being move ordered. Now white often plays king g2 here to try and fight for control of the h file, and then the bishop on e1 is helpful because it controls the h4 square. He could also push, and we'll just play the same moves. White exchanges at this point to prevent us being able to recapture with the bishop, with bishop f8, take on d6. But we're not worried. Bishop around. Now after king g2, white's getting ready for rook h1, but knight h4 check is actually quite annoying. Now our plan is to play the knight around into g5, followed either by hg4 and h3 check, or even sacrificing the knight on h3 to open up white's king. So white could play rook c1 too. Okay, we'll still play bishop f8. And here we can develop the bishop. The pawn can't be taken. Queen takes b7, bishop takes g4 is a disaster for white. And if bishop f2 would be more normal, we can exchange. And now we have got a nice tactic exploiting the bishop, being blocking the rook on f1. The take, we've got f3. We have 2 pawns for the piece, and white's king is just completely opened up. One plan to increase the pressure is bishop h5, g4, queen g5. g3 becomes a big threat, but bishop g3 would allow queen e3 check. So we're getting into white's position. His pieces are so passive, he's not able to exploit his extra piece, and we have a very strong initiative. Once white plays g4, you should always be on the lookout for these various piece sacrifices to push forward our pawns. If we can sacrifice a piece with 2 pawns and open up white's king, then it's generally worthwhile. I could play bishop f2 immediately as well, but it doesn't change very much. We can go rook f7. We're going to play bishop f8 next. With king g2. Here we might as well just play bishop f8. Knight h4 checks are also on the cards, but here we can just play our normal stuff. Rook h7, king g7, bishop e7. And then we can consider whether we're going to play a knight h4 check plan or just queen h8. Or sacrifice on g4, of course. All of those ideas are pinging around. White has to be very careful. So white pushes. Now we're in time, though, to play a5. So we can't stop c5, but the point is that we can play bishop f8 in time and recapture with the bishop. Once we take with the bishop, it's very difficult for white to make any more progress. He can go knight b5 and take on d6, but then we can play cd because that knight has gone, the aggressive piece. The other knight takes too long to join the attack. In the meantime, we're ready to continue attacking over on the king side by king g7 and queen h8. Sorry, rook h7 first, king g7, queen h8, and infiltrate on the h-file. So king g2, white's ready to play rook h1, but we can just continue with that rook f7, bishop f8, rook h7. Once again, c5 works well here to dc, bc. White's not getting anywhere, and otherwise, as we know from the knight bd7 classical lines, this is a very annoying setup with a pawn on c5 for white to actually get past. But once again, we don't need to worry about whether we can play c5 in various positions because white can play different move orders. Once again here, a4 can be met by a5 because that bishop is already ready to take back on d6, or indeed after c5, we can simply take on c5. Probably, well, c5 must be the critical move, but it's not actually a very good one. But without it, it's difficult to know what white is doing. Whereas our plan is obvious. We're just going to continue with the normal stuff. King g7, bishop e7, queen h8, hg4, and knight h4 check being a straightforward plan. And again, remember, keep a lookout for piece sacrifices on g4, especially if white moves his queen away from controlling that d1 to h5 diagonal. So c5, but here we can actually just simply take it. There's nothing wrong with king g7 too, and just continue our normal plan. But we can overwork this bishop on f2. There's holding the h4 square and, well, needs to recapture on c5, which just pawn down. We can take it, throw in the check. And here our plan is simply bishop d7 and queen h8, when we'll take control of the h-file. Then we can play a knight back to g6. hg, rook h2 check is pretty disastrous for white. Remember, always keep a lookout for these piece sacrifices as well. If some bishop takes g4 and f3, especially once that rook on a8 is involved in the attack too. White has slowed our play somewhat with pawn on g4, but we still have very good attacking chances over there. This wraps up our coverage of bishop d2. So we've now seen lines where white plays both knight e1, bishop e3, and knight e1, knight d3, bishop d2. And that covers the vast majority of what's actually played at the moment in all the lines with knight e1. Next, we'll have a look at the lines where white keeps his bishop back on c1, tries to just push, and hopes that the bishop is well enough placed on its starting square. Thanks for watching, and see you again soon. Cheers!